Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon if you are tuning in from this part of the world, or good morning if you're tuning in from the Western Hemisphere. My name is Zishan Salahuddin, and I serve as the Director for the Center for Regional and Global Connectivity at Tabadlab, an advisory services firm and think tank based in Islamabad. Welcome. Our topic for today's is refugees. Tomorrow, the 20th of June, 2023, is World Refugee Day. Our conversation centers on refugees in Pakistan, the historical context, existing policies and frameworks, the gaps that might exist, how Pakistan has struggled to provide for refugees in the last 45 years, and how all of that intersects with the migration issue that now is very prevalent across the world, especially in Europe and other places. And of course, this policy roundtable is very much sombered by the very tragic news over the weekend of a fishing trawler that sank off of the coast of Greece, killing potentially hundreds. At last count, at least 12 Pakistanis had died in that horrific incident. And by some counts, and an unknown source of the Foreign Office, the number might be as high as 300. And what's also particularly shocking about this incident is that even within that migrant boat, there was classism in terms of which migrants or potential economic migrants could house in which section of the boat, which could have also led to a much higher body count depending on where they were stationed within the boat. Well, there's plenty to talk about here. While this conversation is going to predominantly use examples of the Afghan exodus from Afghanistan starting in 1978, there's a lot of other examples around the world, and we have a terrific panel of experts, of commentators, scholars, UNHCR's own spokesperson on the line with us, and I would like to introduce them before we get into the conversation. First, we have Dr. Urzala Nemat. Dr. Urzala is an internationally known Afghan scholar and think tank leader. She's an expert in political ethnography, holding a PhD in development studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and has an MSc in development planning from the University College London. Dr. Nemat recently founded and is leading Development Research Group Limited and has previously served as the director of the Afghan Research and Evaluation Unit between 2016 and 2022. And for those of you that might be familiar with Urzala's work or the work that AREU has done, some of the most terrific research and empirical information generated during that time period inside of Afghanistan. We also have Dr. Roby Alakash with us. She is a lecturer at the Yarmouk University in Jordan, the former visiting research fellow in the Refugees Studies Center at Oxford in the UK. And as a social anthropologist with an interest in the Middle East, urban studies, forced migration, as well as religion and politics, her research is quite interdisciplinary. And I have to say, Dr. Roby, we always love individuals that bring such an interdisciplinary approach to our conversations. And her intersection, of course, lies between social, political, and urban anthropology. Her doctoral thesis, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Roby, was actually also on migrants. Third, we have Rebecca Roby with us. She is the Afghanistan Advocacy Manager at the Norwegian Refugee Council, a very experienced humanitarian aid worker with a long-standing history of working in the nonprofit industry, in a wide variety of roles, particularly in a management capacity. And speaking of intersectionality, also works at the cross-section of international relations, global health, humanitarian assistance, and policy analysis. And we also found out in a preliminary conversation right before the start of this policy roundtable that she might be, and she is in fact, the only individual in this policy roundtable who is in Kabul at the moment as she speaks to us. And finally, we have Ksar Khan Afridi, the spokesperson for the UNHCR Pakistan. His primary role is to provide and raise awareness and advocate for the protection and well-being of refugees, internally displaced persons, stateless individuals, and otherwise forcibly displaced populations. He has demonstrated a notable tenure as an official spokesperson for the UNHCR for well over a decade, and previously, much like myself, was associated with the various newspapers in Pakistan and dabbled in the journalism industry quite a bit. So welcome, Ksar, and welcome to all of my guests. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really, really grateful. We'll dive right into the conversation. I think to set the stage, especially in the Pakistani context, is very important. 1978, the revolution, refugees started pouring into Pakistan. Over just the next few years, there were millions of them here in Pakistan. And since then, we've gone through multiple time periods of, political turmoil, war, all kinds of ethnic strife happening in Afghanistan that has resulted in outflows of refugees from Afghanistan to Pakistan and also to Iran. Iran has also hosted a tremendous amount of refugees during this time. And this pattern has continued for the last 45 years. In fact, at present count, there are still millions of refugees in Pakistan. So my first question, just to set the stage, would be for the spokesperson for the UNHCR, and I'd like for you to tell us what is the quantum and the scale of the refugee crisis in the country, and where do we stand in terms of current numbers, inflows, outflows, and the current strategy that is or policy that is underway to manage this massive humanitarian crisis. Ksar, your mic's off. Sorry. This is going to happen the entire policy roundtable. Happens every policy roundtable. Your mic's off.
Okay. So
we can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So the Afghan refugee situation, I mean, it's a protected refugee situation. And, since 1979, late 70s and early 80s, millions of people were displaced from Afghanistan due to, war and conflicts. And from time to time, like in 1980s, millions, and then in 1992 due to civil war, and then in 1996, and then in 2001, and then in 2021. So millions of people, they came to Pakistan and took refuge. The government of Pakistan, the people in government of Pakistan, they welcomed them. They opened their doors, they opened their hearts, and they supported them during these difficult times. So at the moment, we have different categories of Afghans. They are living in Pakistan. First, 1.3 million Afghan refugees, those who are registered, those who have been registered by the government of Pakistan with the support of UNHCR in 2006 and 7. So these people, these Afghan refugees, they are holding proof of registration cards, and they are residing in different parts of the countries. 52% of the Afghan refugees, they are in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, followed by Balochistan. We are 330,000 people are residing, and then 160,000 people, Afghan refugees, they are in Punjab, and some in Sindh province. Mostly they are living in Karachi. So Afghan refugees, and we have around 54 refugee villages. In the beginning, we used to call them camps, but now we are calling them refugee villages. So 54 refugee villages, mostly these refugee villages are located in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. 46 refugee villages there in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, 10 refugee villages in Balochistan, and 1 in Punjab. So these are the POR card holders, and they are residing, and they have access to health education facilities in Pakistan. They can open their bank account. So these are refugees. The second category of Afghans, those who did not get themselves registered in 2006 and 7. So these, the government of Pakistan decided in 2017 to register these people. So there was an exercise, and during that 6 months exercise, some 850,000 people were registered, and they were given Afghan citizen cards. So they are also living in Pakistan. And then in addition to that, there were some undocumented Afghans who were living in Pakistan and who are not registered. And then in August 2021, due to these developments in Afghanistan, so according to government estimates, around 600,000 people they came to Pakistan, and they are residing in different parts of the countries, mostly in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in Islamabad, in Balochistan, and in other areas. So far, this is the current situation, and we are the first case laws is registered, the second one as well, and but these new arrivals, they have not been registered yet, since we don't have the government of Pakistan didn't sign like here in the 19 Refugee Convention and its 1966 protocols. For us, they are the key legal documents that form the basis of our work. So they define the term refugee for us. We are the guardian. UNHCR serves as the guardian of 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocols. But Pakistan is not a signatory to 1951 Convention and the status of refugees, nor it has enacted any refugee law. So in the absence of law, we have these short-term extensions for POR card holders. And for POR card holder, but at the same time, for the new arrivals, the government doesn't have any law, which is, due to which they are facing multiple challenges, multiple problems, like, for example, access to health, education, and other livelihood initiatives, opportunities. What we are doing, UNHCR, we are talking to the
Ksar
government.
if I may interrupt you here for just a moment. Thank you very much for setting the stage. I will come back to you about the role of UNHCR in Pakistan and what it's currently doing in order to help Afghan refugees in the country, because I think that's a very important part of the conversation. But I did want to toss it to some of our other panelists to make sure we get their input and some of the questions that I have and some of the conversations that we need to have. Tabadlab, the policy advisory firm and the think tank that I work for, in addition to this policy roundtable, is also releasing a working paper on Friday of this week that looks at the refugee crisis in Pakistan and looks at it from the perspective of, all of the different drivers that have been pushing policy in a certain direction, what the policy actually has been for the last 45 years, where do the gaps lie, and what are some of the recommendations moving forward. So it's a very robust, very comprehensive document, primarily put together by our CEO, Mr. Musharraf Zaidi, and where it would shed a lot of light on, the historical context, complete with a range of different timelines that have informed the refugee conversation in Pakistan. And speaking of drivers, there have been, I would say, at least 6 drivers for policy frameworking in Pakistan. The first, as Ksar you mentioned, is the legal framework, which is contradictory. It is inadequate. It leaves a lot of room for exploitation and lack of access. Then there are global alignments and geopolitics that, of course, inform how Pakistan is going to react in a certain situation. We saw that after August 15th, 2021, there was a very strong backlash from Pakistan saying that Pakistan simply cannot afford to take in any more refugees, considering the historical baggage that it has carried for 43 years prior to that. There is identity and culture and how that sort of shapes into everything. Pakistan at this point has more Pashtun ethnic population than Afghanistan does, if you look at the overall makeup of both countries. So therefore, there's a lot of identity and culture that is sort of intertwined. There's the issue of national security. Refugees have often been blamed, despite very little evidence proving this. Outliers notwithstanding, of having linkages with terror networks, with terrorists, or at the very least facilitating nefarious activity in Pakistan. Fifth is governance and institutional capacity. And finally, and I think one of the most important bits is international assistance and multilateralism. Specifically in terms of if Pakistan is to take in these refugees, what kind of international aid is Pakistan going to receive in order to mitigate the drain on social services and other resources that would be put on it by virtue of taking in these additional individuals. So I guess my question is to Urzala and to Becky. And the question is, in your opinion, what is the present state of the global refugee crisis? So let's expand a little bit outside of Afghanistan and the conditions experienced by refugees worldwide, an example of which we have seen with the fishing trawler sinking off the coast of Greece. How do you involve refugee communities in the decision-making processes? I think representation is a very important aspect of this that is often missing from these conversations. And how do you develop programs to ensure that their voices and their perspectives are actually catered to and considered? And for specifically for Becky, can you tell us about the current situation in Afghanistan, and perhaps also what are some of the existing current push factors that contribute to the ongoing displacement to other countries? I'll go to Urzala first. Yes. Unmute, please. There we go.
Thank you, Zeshan. It's a great pleasure and honor to be joining you on this discussion today. I start with expressing my condolences to all the family members of those immediately affected by this ship sinking that involved the life of over 700 people, as it is heard. So if you look at this particular tragic incident, we are reminded that this crisis is becoming more and more serious. And unless we address the core driving factors of conflicts across the world, there might not be any hopes to see any end to these kind of situations where refugees are putting themselves and their lives at incredible levels of risks in order to survive to a better life, quote unquote, better life, because there is still no guarantee nowadays where at the end destinations, whether they will get something, but because of the deterioration of situation in our region, and specifically speaking, everyone is struggling to run away one way or another. So I would like to also highlight that the number of refugees across the world is reaching a record number of 100 million. And 69 of them are coming specifically from countries like Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar. What characterizes each one of these countries is conflicts, alive or ongoing conflict in the country. And the same way, when it comes to Afghanistan refugee situation, as mentioned by Mr. Afridi, this is a protracted refugee crisis. It started from 1978, and it is unfortunately continuing to this day. There has been waves of refugees in each phase of the past 4 to 5 decades. The refugees characterize different characteristics. For example, there were times that more rural people from Afghanistan were migrating and taking refuge more in terms of regional localities or surrounded under different Mujahideen factions and groups. There were times that more educated people from the cities, for example, during '92, we had a massive refugee influx in Pakistan, where I actually am also part of the refugees of the wartime. My family and I migrated to 1989 to 2001. So you would see that there are these waves different. And what characterizes especially this recent wave of refugees is also those mostly coming from the urban, particularly, I'm not saying alone, but mostly those who are coming from urban settings, mostly educated communities, and those who are on transition to a third country. So there are medical refugees, there are seasonal refugees that are due to crises and coming. And the major drivers of these sort of refugee situation or conflicts, what leads people to leave at the top of everything else is the conflict, the war, the injustice. There is a physical stability in Afghanistan these days that also probably surprises some people. But the fact that people, particularly half of the population, lack basic access to, for example, education and jobs, that leads also the recent number of refugees to be in significant number in terms of, the gender aspects. So women and children are again making a vast majority of the 600,000 refugees influxing. So how could be done? How could refugees be involved in decision making and involved in sort of having a better role in their own well-being and the ways that they could support themselves? I think it's very important to respect the dignity of those who are refugees or displaced. It is not fun to leave your home, the place where you're born, where you come from. But then this has to be respected. And even though there are, like you mentioned, Zishan, there are legal ambiguities, there are lots of other drivers and challenges. The reality is that when people are in a very intense situation, they have no choice but to move. When they are arriving there, what I hear a lot from refugees who are currently in different cities of Pakistan is a complete lack of assistance or support or lack of a clear mechanism where they could voice their concerns, where they could channel their messages, their demands, their needs, immediate needs. So the best way forward that I could see in this regard is to really find effective mechanisms to involve refugees representation away from politics, away from, because this is a humanitarian issue. It's the dignity and the humanity aspect of the refugee crisis that needs really prioritization and attention.
Thank you, Urzala. And I'd like to ask Becky to step in now, not just comment on whether or not she agrees with Dr. Urzala's assessment, but also about the current situation in Afghanistan in the context of this conversation.
Thank you very much. I think my mic's working. So as Dr. Urzala mentioned, the security situation in Afghanistan has improved dramatically. Unfortunately, we are still seeing huge drivers of displacement. More and more Afghans are starting to see their future survival as outside of the borders of Afghanistan. So there is still a displacement trend that's going on. And the reasons that drive that are multiple and intersecting. So it's not just the economic crisis that we've seen, it's also some of the structural discrimination that's coming into play. In terms of the economic situation, we saw that Afghanistan, when the Taliban took over, was largely cut off from international financial systems, which has had a huge impact on the country. So we're seeing things like banking sector de-risking and over-compliance with sanctions really impacting people's livelihoods. We've seen the central bank in Afghanistan is still dysfunctional and is largely masked by inflows of humanitarian assistance that keeps things stable. So we see that Afghanistan is being kept stable and the currency and the economy is being kept stable through very large inflows of humanitarian assistance. But this is extremely unsustainable. We recognize as a humanitarian actor that we cannot replace a functioning state. And if the broader global politics are not addressed, the economic situation is likely to deteriorate quite substantially. We also see that Afghanistan is entering its third year of consecutive drought. So that is impacting people's ability to sustain themselves through agriculture. And like I mentioned, we're seeing huge amounts of structural discrimination against certain groups. In the last less than 22 months, we've seen around 50 different edicts issued directly against women and their ability to move and act in public spaces. So we're seeing more and more people who are leaving the country because they want their wives or their daughters or their sisters to access education or to be able to work. We are also seeing, and this is another global trend that is quite alarming, a decrease in humanitarian assistance, particularly for Afghanistan because the conflict is largely over and it is a time of peace, a type of peace, that the humanitarian response plan for this year is only funded by 8%. So that's a huge shortfall that we're facing. And the humanitarian needs of the population have not been addressed in any sort of sustainable way. We also saw that development assistance was frozen when the Taliban took over the country, and 75% of the former government's funding came from outside external assistance. So when we're seeing patterns of displacement of people leaving the country to survive, but also seeking to return to the country now that there's peace and stability, but there are still huge question marks over how the government is going to meet the needs of people who are returning when the humanitarian situation here is still in crisis. So the country is very vulnerable to economic shock at the moment. And what we see in Afghanistan, like we've always seen over the many years of displacement crisis, is that movement for Afghans is a survival mechanism. And it's one that they've lent on heavily over the years. And we've seen these really extractive cycles of displacement. And the last point that I'll mention before I hand back, which I'm happy to speak a bit more on later, is how undocumented Afghans are suffering more than others. We know that to countries like Pakistan and to countries like Iran, there are legal routes available for Afghans. But if you don't have access to civil documentation because you're a woman and you struggle to move without a male chaperone, or because you can't afford the fees for it, then you are forced into perilous, risky, expensive, illegal routes that end up in horrible situations like the incident of the boat off the border of Greece. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky, for sharing this detailed analysis of what is happening in Afghanistan and how the situation, especially considering geopolitics, the sense of donor fatigue that also, of course, kicks in anytime somebody hears Afghanistan's name. And I think one factor that you perhaps didn't directly mention, I think the Ukraine crisis is actually a huge factor as far as managing things in Afghanistan is concerned, simply for the fact that the vast majority of the West's attention, Europe's, UK's, and North America's, is focused on the Ukraine conflict and countering the Kremlin and its military machine. All of that contributes towards it. And it sounds like, Becky, and you can, I'll come back to you in just a bit. You can correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like the refugee crisis out of Afghanistan is not something that is going to go away anytime soon, which means countries like Pakistan, countries like Iran, and other places around the world do need to be prepared for that eventual outcome. I would also like to say here that, I find it a little interesting that the Western part of the world continues to refer to these individuals as illegal migrants. That was the term that was used for the tragedy from the fishing trawler off the coast of Greece as well. But in this part of the world, they're simply refugees and are supposed to be, and it's kind of understood they would be taken care of by neighboring countries. And I would say nowhere else in the world is there an example as comprehensive as that of Pakistan, where long-term refuge has been given to Afghan refugees, as well as freedom of movement, and through proxies, the ability to buy businesses, buy homes, be integrated into the larger society. Of course, at the cost of several other things, but that's a conversation that's happening further down the line. The last thing that I wanted to mention here was the reason this conversation is so important is because, as the Greek tragedy shows us, Pakistanis are also a large number of individuals around the world that are trying to seek better fortunes, better lives, and better futures for themselves. Movement for them, too, is very much about survival. In fact, I read this article recently in which the numbers were that in 2021, there were, I'll actually look at the number right here. There were about 225,000 departures from Pakistan, immigration-wise. And that number nearly quadrupled in 2022 to 765. And I would not be surprised if that number doubles again this year, simply because of the many poly-crises facing Pakistan, particularly among them climate change. And when a population of 240 million faces the kind of crises that Pakistan is facing, it is inevitable that we're going to see refugee movement and migrant movement around the world, particularly to immediate states, but also to the Western Hemisphere, Europe, and whatnot. I'll go to Ksar Khan Afridi and Becky. I'll come back to you in just a second. Ksar Sahab, I'd like to understand from you, what are, in the UNHCR's view, what are some of the global challenges that are sort of driving the refugee experience and displacement trends as you see it now? You also mentioned that Pakistan is currently not a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees or its 1967 protocol. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but there are mechanisms here, for example, the PORs and the ACCs, that are used to both document as well as provide certain social amenities to refugees. And what in your opinion needs to happen in the medium to long term in order to ensure that Pakistan fulfills its obligations, despite not really being a signatory to these international conventions? And Becky, in addition to what you've spoken about already, if you could shed perhaps just a little bit light on what is the experience and long-term trajectory for those who are forced to leave their homes, particularly in Afghanistan, but perhaps a bit of a global lens to that. Ksar Sahab, will come to you first.
Okay, so if we talk about the global displacement, I mean, the world where we live in have been facing multiple challenges. When we switch on the TV, we often see floods, killings, people on the move. So we are witnessing wars and conflict, climate change, population growth, urbanization, displacement. So very little is being done to overcome these challenges. If we look at the trend, at the 2022 global displacement trend, the number of people forcefully displaced by persecution, conflict, and violence, it grew by 21%. So if we included the first half of 2023, the figure reached 110 million people. So, I mean, this is too much. In nutshell, if you say, I mean, we can conclude that 1 in 74 people worldwide remain displaced, and I mean, the situation is quite worse. And then, of course, there are some breakdowns. Countries are hosting mostly refugees. But the most important thing is that 76% of the refugees are being hosted by low and middle income countries. So these figures shows us that the people are quick to indulge in conflicts. There is a lack of political will to resolve these conflicts. And on the other hand, new conflicts are being started. So we see pushbacks, we see tougher immigration and refugee admissions. So, and then on the other hand, we see many countries, they criminalize the immigrants, they stereotype the refugees actually, blaming them for everything. So, but on the other hand, there are countries that have shown extraordinary hospitality by supporting refugees. For such countries, more international support is required. Like for example, Pakistan, Iran, and some other countries which are hosting, the refugees, and they need to be supported. And the most important thing is, for us, is that the countries should join hands to end these conflicts actually, so that refugees could go back to their countries and live happily there. So the main issue is security. So all these there should be a political will to resolve these issues. So in Pakistan, the government and people of Pakistan, they have been very generous, and they have been supporting Afghan refugees for the last many years, and they have provided equal access to education, health facilities, livelihood, and other things. And we are working. The main thing is our solution strategy for Afghan refugees. Our main objective is to empower Afghan refugees, because 65% of the Afghan refugees in Pakistan, they are below the age of 25, and they are youth. So we are implementing different projects, skill development projects, livelihood projects, so that we empower these youth. We empower the youth so that to make them self-reliant, and to so that they can play a positive role in Pakistan. And when they go back to Afghanistan, or if they opt to go back to Afghanistan, they can play a constructive or a positive role in Afghanistan. But at the same time, we are working on solutions. Sometimes it's very challenging, sometimes it's very difficult, but we are doing our advocacy to support, to pave the way for them. So yes, so at the end of the day, we are aiming that these issues will be resolved. But the challenge for us here is the new arrival. When we talk about the new arrivals, so new arrivals mean like those people who arrived from Afghanistan in August in 2021. They were unable to get themselves regularized, so which is impeding, which is hampering. For them to enroll their children in school, to access health facilities, and to get livelihood opportunities. So we are trying our best to resolve these issues with the government.
Thank you, Ksar. And Becky, that question about what is the long-term trajectory for those that are forced to leave their homes? What does it look like?
Thank you. So what we are seeing is some of these very harmful cycles of displacement and debt. So like I was saying before, that people without access to legal documentation inside the country are often forced into risky, illegal routes that are also expensive because they pay smugglers for that. They are the ones that are most likely to be deported back to Afghanistan, back to an environment where we already know they can't survive, and that's why they are taking these risky routes. A couple of months back, I spoke with a family at one of the border points out of Afghanistan where NRC provides humanitarian assistance. Their entire family had just been deported back to Afghanistan, and they were waiting to earn enough money to try again through an illegal route. And I asked them, why would you take this risk? There were members in their previous party that lost their lives in that process. And the response that they give me is that they have no other option. So what is driving them is hope and survival. And what we are worried about going forward, particularly with Afghanistan, is that the population of Afghans are going to lose some of their international protection because the international conflict that was going on here has stopped. The economic crisis is something that many countries don't recognize as a legitimate driving force of displacement. Therefore, people who are considered economic migrants are not given international legal protection. And so that these people may well be criminalized in the future. And they may well be criminalized in the future by the very same countries who are preventing or not doing enough to enable progress with the economic situation. I mentioned earlier the Central Bank of Afghanistan, that it's dysfunctional at the moment. And part of the reason why it's dysfunctional is because the foreign assets that used to belong to that bank are being held somewhere else until the appropriate anti-money laundering processes are put in place. So it is perhaps not a conflict anymore, or not an international conflict, but it is in some ways an economic warfare, and the suffering is still incredibly bad. So, I also wanted to mention that we, particularly NRC in Afghanistan at the moment, we are looking very much to the neighbouring countries to help support dialogue between the de facto authorities and the international community to work towards some sort of political economic roadmap to bring the country out of its current crisis. And as part of that, we are calling for longer term resilience programs to be brought back into Afghanistan to make sure that the people who are living here at the moment are not only just able to survive, but they also have the opportunity to thrive, as is their right, as they should do after so many decades of conflict and destruction in this country. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Becky. And I think it's important to also note here that so much of the work that goes into refugee management is more reactionary than it is proactive, as in states will do a lot to keep illegal migrants out, protect their borders, protect their interests. But addressing the drivers of some of these conflicts that result in people leaving their homes, leaving what they know behind, is seldom addressed. And I think you raised a very interesting point about how it's an economic situation, and economic migration is actually a big thing. And I think the same is true for Pakistan. In this country here, within the last, I would say, 16, 17 months, we have, for all intents and purposes, wiped out the middle class. Inflation, according to government figures, is at 29%. If you quote some international experts, it's at 66%. Food inflation in certain cases is well over 100%. And that is tremendous inflationary pressure on the common consumer, especially the lowest strata of society, which makes up the bulk of the Pakistani population. And that will inevitably result in them seeking better lives, better economic opportunities in other places, and result in or contribute further to the ever expanding, I believe Dr. Urzala mentioned a figure of 100 million migrants approaching around the world. I'm going to come to Dr. Ruba Alakash because she's been patiently waiting. And this is perhaps one of the most important aspects of this entire conversation. And I've saved this question for you, Dr. Ruba, because I think your perspective would be tremendous in this regard. And that is the importance of providing immediate humanitarian assistance while simultaneously, and that word is important, simultaneously working on long-term solutions. I find that a lot of times we are very enamored with what we need to do now. We need to secure humanitarian assistance. We need to ensure these guys don't starve. They have blankets, they have tents, they're taken care of in the winters. But long-term solutions are not really something that are looked at. Even in Pakistan, where we have hosted refugees for 45 years, there isn't really any long-term mechanism. As Ksar Saab said, we keep renewing the PORs, we keep renewing other documentation and keep using ad hoc policies to manage the crisis. But there isn't really long-term technical solutions to the problem. So I guess my question to you would be, what are some of the ways to explore, burden sharing, resettlement programs? How do we create more safe pathways for refugees while providing for them in the short term and simultaneously working on it in the long term? And connected to that, right after Ruba, Urzala, if I can come to you with a question of how do we ensure that the long-term needs of refugees are correctly identified and then addressed beyond the immediate humanitarian assistance, which you can very easily put together. I'll come to you first, Dr. Ruba.
Thank you, Zishan. I'm really happy to be in this discussion, this thought-provoking discussion. I just want to say something. In Jordan, we have waves after waves of refugees, not just the Syrian refugees. Jordan has been a safe haven for refugees fleeing conflict from neighboring countries since the mid-20th century. Palestinians, first wave in 1948, second wave in 1967. We have Lebanese, Iraqis, and the list goes on and on. We have refugees of over 57 nationalities in Jordan. However, the recent wave of over 1 million Syrians has placed the country under significant strain because of its intensity and it's very rapid. So the country was not prepared to host this big number of Syrian refugees. Of course, all the countries have big challenges in providing humanitarian assistance for refugees. I would say enough humanitarian assistance to all refugees. In Jordan, particularly, we have limited resources and weak infrastructure. We are a middle-income country, so these strains existed before even the refugees came to Jordan. We are the second poorest country in the world in water resources, and we have limited energy resources. Although the refugees receive various forms of assistance from various international NGOs that are working, we have around 200 NGOs and international organizations that are working in Jordan. They provide various types of humanitarian assistance, such as access to health, education, services, legal services, asylum procedures, all this stuff. However, we still have big problems in providing enough humanitarian aid for all refugees. Also, we have the Jordanian response plan for Syrian refugee crisis. Its top priority has to empower the local communities to address challenges, including protection of the dignity and welfare of Syrian refugees and vulnerable Jordanians impacted by the Syrian crisis. I would say after 12 years of displacement, we should now move forward and we should expand our perspective from just providing humanitarian assistance for refugees to look for more long-term solutions, sustainable solutions that benefit refugees and host communities. Addressing the long-term needs of refugees, from my point of view, requires a comprehensive and multi-dimensional approach that considers their education, livelihoods, legal status, healthcare, and social integration. Also, by focusing on empowerment, collaboration, and sustainable solution, we can support refugees in rebuilding their lives and realizing their full potential. Since July 2016 and the London Pact, Jordanian signed the London Pact, the Jordanian government has granted more than 200,000 work permits for Syrian refugees, allowing them to work legally and earn an income for their families, which is now the main focus. We should move from providing the humanitarian assistance to make them self-reliant, build their capacities, and work more on local integration and including them to include them in the local communities. Also, there's a very important point, which is support home-based businesses, because the vast majority of refugee population, more than 50% of the refugee population are women. So we should support home-based businesses. Also, we need support from the international community. The most important point, I think we need to establish a safe and legal migration channels for refugees, including family reunification, student visas, work visas, to enable refugees to access protection and other opportunities without resorting to dangerous and irregular migration methods. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruba. Dr. Urzala, the question.
Thank you, Zishan. Whether inside Afghanistan or beyond its border, seeking a longer-term solution to the crisis to put an end to the key drivers of refugee and migration is most crucial. Because as long as there is crisis, and by the way, I would have strong reservation to see the current wave or influx of refugees out of Afghanistan as only economic refugees or migrants. There is political concern. Half of the population are denied their basic and fundamental rights. This is a kind of, whether we can call it a government or not, is a kind of a government that is run by only one political group, the Taliban. You are either a Taliban or you are nobody to be part of decision-making, part of political decision-making and processes. So in this kind of way where the rest of the population don't see themselves represented, don't see any form of accountability, don't see any form of services, in addition to the economic crisis, as mentioned by Becky, I think it's obvious that people will see no future for themselves, for the type of people that are deciding to leave Afghanistan. Many of them whom I know have never left Afghanistan before. But now they say, look, what is the future here? So while we have to work in terms of the humanitarian response, I think it's most crucial to also keep parallel to that negotiations, talks, engagements, political pressure, diplomatic pressure globally. I'm not here talking only about Pakistan. Pakistan has a huge responsibility for reasons that probably is beyond discussions here, towards Afghanistan and the current authorities to pressurize them to bring some changes in their approaches to governance in order for the rest of the population to not run away from the country and they left to rule on the mountains and roads, you know. So that is really critical. And then we have to also remember, I would like to draw your attention to another highly expected wave of migration coming from South and Southeastern Afghanistan, because the current authorities are pushing quite aggressively on the opium ban. And that means hundreds and thousands of farmers I'm not talking here about the ones who are making mega sort of benefits out of the drug trading, but the thousands of farmers will have no choice but to leave their villages, their areas, in search of jobs, in search of livelihoods and survival, as it was mentioned. So we have to seriously work on parallel fronts in order to address this issue. Otherwise, people from Afghanistan will be forced to leave for Iran or for Pakistan. And obviously, Pakistan or Iran themselves are going through their own crises, and that will also pressurize the whole world for this displacement. Another point I would like to make here is with regard to our overall approach to refugees and refugee management. Over the years, and following this and experiencing it myself as the recipient of refugee assistance or as a refugee or move on, I think one thing that we can conclude quite safely is the fact that the states and even the United Nations are not successful in managing the refugee situation very well, with the only prioritizing the humanitarian assistance or supports. I think this is probably the time, particularly for the younger generation of entrepreneurs, businesses, to look into an opportunity in this crisis. Mr. Afridi mentioned, and also others, about how inevitable, unfortunately, this crisis is, and it may get worse as we move on. The question is, should we leave this to the governments and to the mega institutions with incredible administrative charges and high salaries, as we all know, to manage this crisis, or can we do something different? And to begin with, I think one of the best sort of examples could be opening job opportunities and opening safe space for people who are arriving as refugees to the hosting countries, opening job opportunities for them, and particularly opening educational opportunities for them. And as I mentioned earlier, a significant number of people who are arriving in Pakistan these days are young, and particularly young women. So are there openness in the Pakistani universities across the country to accept them as, with the scholarships, with support, so that they are integrated constructively? And also, like, finding job or education opportunities will contribute back when the times are beyond the crises that we are talking about. So this way of looking, and let's also not forget another final point, which is the fact that this 3.7 million, including the ones who are registered or the ones that are unfortunately undocumented or not registered, they are a workforce, a cheap labor for both countries, particularly Iran and Pakistan. Both are having this workforce that are probably accepting less pay and doing and contributing to the job market. So if we find creative ways of involving them in constructive ways, then we will avoid a future of turning Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran and the rest of the world, throw them into hubs for terrorist activities. Because what drives people to go to terrorism and radicalism? It is lack of opportunities in this world where they are promised something in the future. So I think these are the probably potentially best ways to look into it. There has been smaller examples, but we look for larger ones to take much more proactive actions on this regard.
Absolutely. And thank you, Urzala. I always rely on you to provide, the most straightforward, the most blunt, and the most comprehensive analysis on the situation. And I completely agree with you. Education and job opportunities, at the median age of 19.1, I think Afghanistan probably has the world's youngest population, with the possible and salient exception of sub-Saharan Africa. And that speaks volumes to what actually can be done to capitalize on that massive workforce, instead of treating them as, a burden on the state, or simply labeling them as a crisis to be managed. Very much agreed on all counts. I have one last question, which will be directed to Dr. Ruba and Becky. But before I do that, there's one quick question. Ksar Saab, if you could kindly answer that as succinctly and as concisely as possible, because I think it's important for us to hear it directly from the UNHCR. And that is, how important is it for Pakistan to sign the UN Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol? Sorry, the mic is muted. Every time. We're good now.
Can you hear me? Okay. So UNHCR has been supporting the government of Pakistan to provide protection and assistance to Afghans and other refugees since 1980s. And despite the fact that the government did not sign the Refugee Convention, it has been generous to host millions of people in Pakistan, millions of Afghan refugees. And Pakistan deserve appreciation for that. As I said earlier, like we have been advocating with the government to find solutions for the Afghan refugees as well as for the new arrivals, and discussion has been ongoing with the government on mechanism and measures to to protect the people who have arrived since August 2021. And we hope that there will be some positive outcomes in the near future. And the signing of the convention that we have been advocating for the last many years, and we hope that one day Pakistan will sign the convention. But despite all that, Pakistan has been hosting the refugees, millions of refugees for the last many decades. So let's hope for the best.
Thank you, Ksar. And my final question, which I'm going to direct at Dr. Ruba and Becky. There's this conversation that happens in this country quite a bit about integration versus return, about whether or not we should just give citizenship to all of the Afghan refugees that are in this country, particularly the ones that were born here, or if efforts should be made to return them to their host countries. And there's, of course, multiple gaps that inform this as well in the overall context. There's their uncertainty of status. There's the vulnerability of to exploitation. There's lack of justice, or at the very least, the lack of access to due process. There's lack of representation, as we spoke about earlier. There's the mitigation of the burden placed on both public and private health providers, education providers, and then there's the whole question of terror linkages and how it's used as a political tool. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. So my question first to Dr. Ruba is, could you discuss the significance of some of the regional and local factors that are shaping these realities, and how that juxtaposition begs this question, whether this question is even valid after 45 years in Pakistan, or say after 12 years in Jordan, and if countries like Pakistan and Jordan should just give blanket citizenship, especially considering the situation, as we have heard from Becky, in terms of how it's unfolding in Afghanistan, and from Dr. Urzala in terms of how it's going to continue to go that way. And by the way, Dr. Urzala, I want to clarify, I did not, of course, intend to mean that the economic issue is the only factor. I merely meant that this is one of the many factors that contribute towards outflows as far as refugees are concerned. So that's the question for Dr. Ruba. And for Becky, and we'll close out there. Normally, we close these conversations with a round of policy recommendations from everyone, but I think the conversation has been so rich and so robust, and recommendations have just poured forth from all of our participants that there's no need for that extra section. So for Becky, given this question of integration and return, given that you're working for the NRC in Kabul right now, what are some of the conditions that need to be prevalent in Afghanistan to actually enable some of these sustainable returns, if you feel that that at all is something that is the right thing to do, given where the crisis currently stands? Dr. Ruba first.
I would say always with displacement comes always the negative results. So for Syrian refugees in Jordan, they are now protracted here in Jordan. They can't go back to their country, and they feel uncertain. They feel of uncertainty here in Jordan. So at the long term, they want something to feel them secure and safety and to go on their lives. I think also there's a socio-cultural context here in Jordan. Syrian refugees from the same background as Jordanian. Jordan and Syria used to be one country before colonization. So we have different connections with the Syrians. We have marriage between Syrians and refugees, also Syrian refugees. And also there's like in Dir'a and Rabha, which is two towns, border towns, one in Jordan and one Syria. Some people from Syria have land in Jordan, and some of Jordanian people have lands in Syria. So we have long established relationship with the Syrian refugees, and we have a lot of relationship with our brothers, let's say, Syrians. So I don't know if on the long term how their situation in Jordan will change. Maybe if we look at the durable solutions of a durable solution to the third one of resettlement, most of the Syrians they want to go to a third country, maybe European or America or Canada, and the UNHCR is now working on a resettlement program, but it's very slow now in Jordan. Also, the political dynamics, the political structure and dynamics within Jordan and within Syria have a profound impact on the experiences of migrants and refugees. Legislation and level of inclusiveness in decision-making processes determine the extent to which migrants and refugees can exercise their rights, access to services, and participate in the society. Also, economic opportunities, I think. Economic opportunities is very important. Job opportunities, labor markets, and availability of social economic support systems shape the experiences of Syrian refugees here in Jordan. Limited access to formal employment can also impact their socio-economic integration and overall well-being. The last point that I want to add is the host community attitudes and social cohesion. The attitudes and perceptions of host communities toward Syrian refugees here in Jordan is very positive. They have the Jordanians have positive attitudes and acceptance, and they support the Syrian refugees. However, at some point, they feel that the Syrian refugees are taking their jobs and they are putting extra, let's say, they are exhausting the resources in Jordan. So the protracted displacement of Syrian refugees here in Jordan we should look at it from a comprehensive approach, and we should listen to their voices and open a dialogue between the refugees, the government, and the international community to hear their voices and to know what they want. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruba. Becky, last word's yours.
I'll be very succinct. So what would have to be in place for people to return and for this to be effective and sustainable? They would need to be able to survive without external humanitarian assistance. And you look at the situation in Afghanistan at the moment, where 2/3 of the population are currently relying on humanitarian assistance. We are a very long way off any sort of sustainable returns. Particularly, as mentioned by Dr. Urzala, some of the governance issues which have not been addressed around structural discrimination as a key factor for displacement. So I think the point that I really want to close this with is that it is not okay to be returning Afghans to Afghanistan at the moment. It is not safe and it is not sustainable. I hope that will be the case in the future, but the conditions are not currently conducive to sustainable returns, even for those who are undocumented, who are being deported. In fact, especially for those who are undocumented and are being deported. Quite often those are the ones who are most in need of international protection because they are most vulnerable. And one last point, we have noted in some of the deportations that are happening that it is from neighbouring countries, is that there are politically marginalised groups who are currently being deported back to Afghanistan, and it is extremely dangerous for that to be happening. So a real plea to maintain international protection for Afghan refugees, neighbouring countries and internationally as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky, for that final word and for also keeping it succinct. I know many people have to have other engagements that they need to get to. I want to sincerely thank all four of my panelists, Dr. Urzala Nemat, Dr. Ruba Alakash, Rebecca Roby, and Ksar Khan Afridi. Thank you very much for being with us today. And also to our audience, I want to just briefly and quickly remind the audience that our working paper on Afghan refugees and the 45-year history in Pakistan will be launched on this Friday, the 23rd. Please take a look at it on our website. It will be across all of our social media. And with that, we come to a close of this Tabadlab Policy Roundtable that has been a day ahead of the World Refugee Day to speak about the various issues faced by migrants and refugees across the world, particularly in Pakistan and particularly in the context of Afghanistan. Thank you very much for joining us. Hope to see you soon. See you next time. Khuda Hafiz.